Welcome back to Unscripted. I am here today with Katy Smith. She's an independent journalist, and today we're talking about a medical kidnapping case that is currently happening right now in Oklahoma. So it's a pretty time-sensitive subject. We actually have a court date. When is that? Next week?
December 16th.
December 16th.
In Canadian County.
Okay, so she's going to fill us in on not only what's happening with this case, but also how we got here and about the system and how broken it is, and then maybe what we can do to help contribute and fix it. So.
Sounds good. So this case has a lot of elements, and one that I think is really important is that the mom in this case is Dana Mooney, and she is a local chapter chair for Moms for Liberty, which is a conservative group that sticks up for parents' rights at school board meetings, within the medical community, with DHS. She's one of only 4 chapter chairs here in Oklahoma, and 2 of those 4 women who fight for parents' rights here have had their sons medically kidnapped.
So when she called me, actually I initially connected with the other mom. Okay. When she was under gag order, wasn't able to speak. She had the other friend call me, and I was like, I immediately said, they're making an example out of y'all. And they were like, oh yeah, and we know it, and we're not going to stand for it. And so that's why they're just reaching out to everybody, like, we've got to make this more public, because it's very clear what they're doing.
There is definitely, to not suspect that there's political targeting in this case would be unwise.
Right.
Because 50% of these women have had their children actually taken because of their positions on things. And I did some reporting. So my outlet, you can find it at v1sut.com. And I've done some reporting, several articles on different aspects of this case. So this case is about Presten Mooney Henderson, and he is 17 years old, Dana's son. He is autistic, highly functioning autistic, and he was also diagnosed with CML, so a chronic form of leukemia that is more commonly diagnosed in autistic kids and people than it is in non-autistic people.
I did not know that.
Yes, and as we start to talk about the gene mutations, it makes some sense. I've had to sort of catch up on the medical side, so it'll be good to get your input about that. But he was diagnosed at OU Children's back in early 2024, very early 2024, and went through conventional treatment. They did the chemotherapy, they did the blood transfusions, they did those things, and it did not work well for Presten. His health got worse. So Dana Mooney, the mom, decided to take another path, and she left OU Children's. She sought all kinds of gene testing to find out what his deficiencies were, what else was going on with him, and found a holistic healer, much like yourself, who was guiding her through that process.
Now, Presten actually asked her to stop the treatment at one point, didn't he? Earlier on. So he was like, I don't want to do this anymore. So it was kind of, even though he's autistic, like you said, high functioning, he should have some say-so as well at 17 years old.
Presten knows his mind. He knows everything that's happening. He's a very smart kid. He understands the process and what's going on with DHS. But they had no contact with OU Medical, with OU Children's for over a year. And then on September 29th of this year, an anonymous tip came into the Child Abuse and Neglect Hotline, which is a big aspect of this case. Anonymously, someone can say that you've been abusive or neglectful to your child, and you never know who your accuser is, and an investigation is prompted.
Well, I think they know. Highly suspect.
I think they do too.
Yeah.
But at first, this could happen to anybody. That someone who's politically persecuting you, who has access to the DHS system or is within it, can accuse you of neglecting or abusing your child, and suddenly you're in the middle of an investigation and your child is no longer in your custody. But a DHS worker came to the home on September 29th. At the time, Presten, who had gained 20 pounds and was much healthier under the holistic treatment, was out back with his stepfather helping mow the lawn. This was not a child who was in dire need of urgent care,
so
right?
I keep telling people DHS came to take him and he was mowing.
Yes.
So he's obviously not. Their whole case was that he's on his deathbed and she's going to kill him.
Correct.
And he's mowing the lawn.
Correct. That was even said in court at 2 different hearings, even when Presten popped up on the screen to talk for himself, and it clearly wasn't true. So, but they basically told mom that they were investigating medical neglect. She explained what was going on and that he had a provider. She was not neglecting him in any way. They were doing all kinds of things at home, therapies, supplements, in addition to what the provider was doing with them. And they said, yeah, we think this is a retaliatory report. We just need to meet with your provider.
Which is an MD, correct?
No, this one wasn't. This is a woman who has 2 different PhDs in this different kind of healing.
Okay.
Later on, that does come into play. So,
okay.
So she set up that appointment with Presten's provider and DHS wanted it late on a Friday, which is telling. And when they got there, for them to be able to sit down and the DHS worker to understand what his treatment plan was, and she had to have Presten there, the DHS worker showed up with a court order to take him into custody and 2 police officers. Never heard about what the plan was, never talked to the provider. They already had gone to the court to take custody of him. So these things happen very, very quickly. And it happened on a Friday evening, which I believe is intentional. I hear this from other families, because he was immediately taken to OU Children's and they started blood transfusions. They started chemotherapy. They did a bone marrow biopsy. All of these things are happening over a weekend when you can't get a court to give an injunction. You can't stop any of these things.
Yep.
So immediately his health started to plummet. They had court on the following Monday, which is called a show cause hearing in DHS, where the government has to show cause for taking your child, for reaching into your family. And at that show cause hearing, she has a very competent attorney, which is unusual for DHS cases. Usually those parents are on their own, and everything's rubber stamped in those hearings about did the government have the right last exactly 2 minutes. I've been in many of them. But she had a very good attorney. His name's Daniel McClure, and he's actually running for DA out in Pottawatomie County, which will be interesting to see how the system changes there if he should win that seat. But the judge determined after the hearing and everything presented by Daniel McClure that they had not met the statutory requirement to say that he was neglected in any way. And the judge put him back into his mother's custody. So there's Presten in a hospital bed flowing with the chemicals that the family did not want, that didn't work before, the exact same ones, in the hospital, and you'd think she can just go get her child. No. The assistant district attorney out there in Canadian County said, nope, we intend to appeal. So for 3 days, this appeal period, while we were appealing this decision, he can't go anywhere. He has to continue these unwanted treatments. So 3 more days in the hospital. And then at the end of the 3 days, the DA never appealed the decision. And they were informed by both DHS and the hospital that if they tried to take him out, reminder, he's back in his mother's custody, that they would be considering it against medical advice, and that they would be calling the police, that she could be charged, and that they would be calling DHS, and the whole thing would start over again. So basically held hostage.
So the crazy part is, I know in this situation it's a cancer and chemotherapy, but this can happen if you take your kid to a pediatrician and refuse vaccinations. They pick up the phone and they call medical neglect.
It can.
And so I had...
And it has.
Yes, it has. And people don't know that it's happening in Oklahoma. And so I have 2 clients that were going to a more functional pediatric clinic here in Oklahoma.
Okay.
And since have came to us and said they questioned them several times about vaccines, and because of this case they got very nervous and were uncomfortable to go back, because they're like, they never asked us about that before, and like, is this an insurance thing? Like, why are they asking us these questions? But now if we go back, are they going to turn us in? And they're more holistic minded at that clinic. And I was like, yeah, we're not turning anybody in here.
That's not what we're here
it's
for.
It's a safe place. Yeah.
But it does show you, there's this really unholy alliance between the traditional medical establishment and DHS, and sort of this massive progressive and tyrannical ideology that just does not respect a parent's rights and a family's rights to make their own decisions. So there's a lot of flags that you see constantly with DHS cases. And not vaccinated, that's a flag. That's going to get them Digging further into your life, homeschoolers experience a lot of persecution. Even though in Oklahoma, our law says you don't have to send your kids to school, you do not have to follow any approved curriculum, but they still, even on the Mooney's case, there was educational neglect was investigated and not substantiated, because when Presten was diagnosed, they decided to pull him out. He was immunocompromised, and homeschool instead, because that was healthier for him. But they went ahead and investigated educational neglect. So it's very tyrannical. If you don't go along with the government prescribed way to do things.
Even if you're following the law, it says we don't have to do those things.
Correct.
But then we get in trouble for not doing them.
Correct. Even in the first show cause hearing, they showed that DHS didn't follow the law. It didn't matter. She couldn't get her child back.
Which they were just going to follow her home and take him again.
Correct. And so before we go to the next part of it, I think it's important to back up and understand, particularly with what you brought up about vaccines. Presten is a vaccine-injured child. Presten was developing very normally when he was born in 2008, I believe. Mom said he was even advanced as far as verbally. He was potty trained for a boy at the age of 2, which is unheard of if you've raised any boys, right?
Yeah.
Completely hitting every single developmental marker. He got his 2-year-old shots, and he immediately started having seizures. She said he was having 40 to 60 seizures a day.
Oh my
They couldn't even treat him at OU Children's. So this is back in 2008. She's had a relationship with this hospital since this child was a toddler. She had to drive back and forth to appointments at a facility in Fort Worth, Texas, just trying to find out what they could do for him. Nobody would acknowledge the vaccine damage, even though the timing is exactly when he had his 2-year-old shots. He was diagnosed with 3 different forms of epilepsy and autism after his 2-year-old shots. And she is a very smart mom. They told her he would only basically ever be able to learn about 10 words. So she had to choose those words very carefully. They very much said his development would be completely arrested. She did not take that as an answer. And she went to healers like you. She did all kinds of research. She looked into what was going on genetically with him. And she went to all kinds of therapies that she described to me. She worked harder than any parent should have to restore their child's health. And he thrived. He's a very high functioning teenager. So she did incredible work outside of the medical system with all of this and finding different places that were not conventional Western medicine. So her trust for this system was very low. They permanently injured her child.
Yeah.
And now 15 years later, when he's diagnosed and their treatments don't work out, she's persecuted and he's taken away from her. So you kind of have to understand that. And then you layer on that she's a parents' rights advocate, very much so, because she had an injured child from the system, and she's targeted. She's absolutely targeted.
And I love the direction that she went, because it can go either direction. But for me, I believe the healthiest route to go is when something happens, acknowledging like it was very obvious that the shots caused it. So why don't we educate people so that this doesn't happen to anybody else? Right. And so she, took that even further, being an advocate. But there are a lot of patients, or a lot of parents, I believe, who probably deep down know. And it's really hard. I vaccinated my older 2, but it's really hard to admit that you did something that you know caused damage. And so the way that she did it, I feel like, is the healthiest way to say, we're not going to let this happen to anybody else, that's going to listen. If somebody's going to listen, we're going to let them know that this is dangerous. But even speaking out about it makes you a target.
It does make
Talking
you a target.
about vaccines makes you. I had someone ask me today, do you ever get worried about being targeted or something? And I was like, what do you mean? Like, no, I just wake up and do this every day, Right. But they were saying, with you having your podcast and social media and with your office, the things that you post are going to not make a lot of people happy. But I'm in the same place that she is. I've seen these things clinically I have 2 older kids that were vaccine injured, but not to the level of autism. Theirs were allergies, asthma, eczema, and they, thankfully, minor injuries, we detox them and they don't have any issues. But unfortunately, that's not always the case. and they don't always fully recover from that. So
right, and think about them not acknowledging the source of his injury, essentially, and then just limiting what he'll ever be, giving her those verbal directives that he's only going to have 10 words.
Where do they even come up with that? Like, there's really no way to say they're going to say 7 words or 10 words. Like, I just feel like that's such a...
It does, and I feel like it's cover for where the injury came from, because just like you're saying, if you can get to the cause of it, maybe we can solve some of this.
Yeah.
Which it gets kind of interesting as we get into this. So back to his story. So there he is, back in his mother's custody, but they won't let them out of the hospital. They're threatened with arresting her and basically taking him into custody. So you've got the medical establishment working hand in hand with DHS. They never disagree. If the parents aren't happy with the treatment or whatever, that's a cause for DHS to be concerned. You can't go against the establishment. But so there they are in the hospital. She's having to tiptoe as they're doing things with her child that she doesn't agree with for a couple of reasons. She, while they were in custody, she had someone from DHS sitting in his hospital room 24/7, not looking out for him, but watching her. So she had to toe the line there. And if she bucked, even though he was in her custody, once he was back in her custody, sort of the babysitter from DHS left. But if she bucked the treatment too much, they were going to call DHS and say she's medically neglectful. She's not letting us do everything that she could. So meanwhile, Presten's health is plummeting. And she gets in touch with me and she said, I trust you to tell his story. He wants to talk. So I went to the hospital to interview Presten, and I was shocked. I was shocked that a kid that was mowing the lawn, just maybe 11 days before, he was non-ambulatory. He could not get out of the bed himself. They had to bring in a wheelchair to bring him for an MRI that day. I had to sort of wait and split up the interview. And he couldn't even make it through the MRI because of his pain level. The bone marrow biopsy that they insisted on doing caused a massive infection. So he was flowing with antibiotics. They would not allow her to give probiotics even to this immunocompromised child, which didn't make sense to me. And I have no medical knowledge.
I mean, there's medical research proving that you need to take probiotics with antibiotics.
Yes.
And the fact that they won't even allow it, like, yes, do the antibiotics, but can I give this? No.
Yes, no, everything was a no, everything that she wanted. She asked about the blood transfusions and could they guarantee that they wouldn't have COVID vaccine in them. Well, just another red flag against her. And no, they would not respect that of the mother's wishes. She asked if with the chemotherapy, and we need to talk about the verbiage there too. With the chemotherapy, she wanted to give leucovorin. So, and Donald Trump and Robert Kennedy said leucovorin recently at a press conference when they were talking about the possible causes of autism. They were talking about Tylenol, and they were talking about leucovorin as something that is given with cancer treatment to help with those symptoms. And is also, then it was found that it helps with the symptoms of autism. And the reason, I don't know, you may want to say this rather than me, but the reason that that's true is this one gene mutation is involved in both. It's basically that the folinic acid is being blocked from getting to these cells, and that's sort of a cause in both of these things. So you would think that they would be sort of up to speed on that and okay with it. I mean, there's no harm to be done with giving it. They would not give it.
And it's a prescription. Like
Correct.
A probiotic is more of a supplement, and that makes sense that they would say, nope, we don't believe in that. But to refuse a prescription is even odd because they know it's going to improve his outcomes. To me, I'm thinking the worst. I'm like, nope, they don't want him to get well, So
that's what it felt like.
Because they're blocking every avenue.
It took a lot for her to get them to even give the leucovorin. That was way into it when they finally said, oh yeah, we'll start giving that. She had been giving him topical for the testing that she'd done over that year away from OU children showed that his glutathione level was non-existent. When you talk about cell repair and all those kind of things for someone who has cancer, at first they wouldn't let her do that. But then as time went on and she kept pushing the information, and you find that one provider who's brave enough in this whole team to say, oh, okay, they started to do that. The funny thing is, I'm not funny, but I'm there trying to interview him, and he is crying out in pain. at least every minute, even though he's on 3 different painkillers. He has this massive hematoma on his hip. I even published pictures of that and a video of him even attempting to get to the wheelchair. He's got all those antibiotics going through him. This child is so sick. He showed up well enough to be out weeding the lawn, and now this is, I really, the feeling in my heart was, are they trying to kill this kid? Is this political persecution to that level? Can that happen? So eventually, like any mom, she asserted her rights. She said, he's back in my custody. I'm leaving. He'd been there like 2 weeks. And so on a Friday night, she said, I have a letter. I have 2 different providers. I have an MD that's going to be taking over his care outpatient. She was not leaving against medical advice. She was making another choice, which is her right to do. And the immediate threat was, we will call police and we will call DHS. I actually published an audio recording in the room that night of them telling her that if she left, those would be the consequences. And State Senator Shane Jett showed up in the middle of the night and asserted her rights, got them to do the appropriate paperwork, and they walked out of there because that was her right to do so. Within hours, they left at about 3 o'clock in the morning, and within hours, DHS was banging on her door again, and it all started all over again. And he was taken back into custody. There was about a week in between that he was out with his mom, and they had a sign on the door per their new provider that no one's coming in. This is an immunocompromised child. Only, medical caregivers and family are coming in and out. If you're DHS or anyone else, call her lawyer. So DHS was in touch with her legal representation. They were providing all of the information that was requested, but it didn't matter. They went and met with their provider in Tulsa, a MD named Dr. Marsh, who had agreed and provided a letter, said that he'd provide his care. He said they were doing great. They checked blood levels. Blood levels were starting to come down. He said, you all are doing a great job. She was set up to meet with another provider who would be treating the CML, a more holistic provider, and he wanted 2 weeks of him off of chemotherapy before he saw him. So they hadn't seen him yet, but it didn't matter. They came and they threatened her with arrest and took him back to OU Children's. He was doing much better then. He was not in harm's way. He was not on death's door, but they got an emergency custody order saying it was critical, that he had to be. So they sat him in a hospital bed and they waited for another hearing.
So they didn't even give any treatment the second time?
No.
It was just like a holding cell, basically?
Basically, it was on a Wednesday that they took him, and the second show cause hearing was on a Friday. So at both of the show cause hearings, it was found that the DHS worker, and actually it was the DHS supervisor, lied, omitted evidence about saying she didn't have providers when she did, lied about his physical condition. The second time, they dragged in all the experts from OU. And that is where, even though DHS was caught lying on the stand and the judge acknowledged that, the second time he actually reprimanded Presten into permanent state custody because he said he was going with the experts who said he was at death's door. On the way home from the hearing, or back to the hospital from the hearing, Dana Mooney got a call saying that Presten would be discharged within the next 24 hours. So I don't know how DHS goes into a hearing and says he absolutely needs hospital level care. He is at risk of death. And then as soon as they get their way in court, even though they're caught lying, they say he's going to be discharged within 24 hours.
So they put him in permanent state custody?
They put him right now. He is in foster care, but he is placed with a relative, with his father, actually.
Okay.
And that was a little bit of hoop jumping to be able to get him there. He went to an aunt and then to his father.
And Dana said the father's been supportive.
Yes.
Through the whole journey, but
yep,
we know men are more likely to go along with what DHS is telling than moms are going to stand up and fight for him. So she's like, he is doing what he has to do to make sure that he can stay with his dad.
Absolutely.
But that doesn't make it easier because they've taken her voice away. So she doesn't get to advocate for her kid. And even though he's autistic, he's 17 and high functioning, and he can't even advocate for himself.
Well, it's interesting because on the investigation, on the paperwork from DHS that was provided to the parents, and I can tell you, I've talked to his father as well. I talked to him at court. I talked to his stepmother. They co-parent together. It looks like they're very much a team. He was very upset about the DHS involvement as well, the lies they were telling in court. But on the paperwork, they're also investigating him for failure to protect on this medical neglect.
Really?
Yes, but then DHS turned around and said, but it's okay that we're going to go ahead and place with him. Their only concern in this is that he be separated from his mother, which is where the political persecution lies. She is the Moms for Liberty chair. She's actually gone up against the chair of our House Senate HHS committee, Health and Human Services, who's over DHS. He's over the hospital institutions, the state-run hospitals. He's over the money part of this and the healthcare authority. He's over the licensure boards for physicians in this state. And you should know that the doctor that Dana Mooney had gotten to take over care so that she could leave the hospital, despite meeting with them, saying things are going great. We did these labs. It's headed in the right direction. Within 24 hours of that visit, he entered a letter into the OU records that said he would no longer provide care.
So immediately backed out.
Immediately backed out.
Threatened by DHS.
You don't get to know what the contact was, who threatened him. Physicians have a lot to lose if they don't have their license.
Yeah.
They have a lot to lose. Their patients have a lot to lose. This is when we see, this is the second time I've seen some kind of pressure be put on a physician to back out of a fight like this. So, and Dana Mooney went up against that chair. That chair is Senator Paul Racino. He's actually her senator of record out in Canadian County, and he has not talked to any of them. He went to the media to say everything that's being reported about this case is misinformation. He said that independent journalists like myself shouldn't have a platform to say these things. He said it was unfair to him. That's her senator of record. Yet Senator Shane Jett showed up in the middle of the night at the hospital to advocate for parents' rights. And he's not even her senator. But back when, I don't know if you remember when the sad case of a girl named Dagny, who in Payne County, I believe, committed suicide. The media wanted to make it a transgender bullying kind of a case. But it's actually, she had been on a couple of different psychotropics. She'd been sexually abused by her own father, who went to prison for it. She had a lot of things going on, but they wanted to make it about her being so-called transgender, and they kept using another name for her in the media. Well, Senator Racino put a bill up that would have basically allowed a whole lot of censorship to the powers that be, and sort of guised it under this Nex Benedict, her name was really Dagny Benedict, case. And Dana Mooney fought back against that because it was just, they never let a crisis go to waste where they can step on people's personal liberties. And that's what the bill was about. And she personally stood up against it. She led a grassroots effort against it. And now the man that controls this entire apparatus, has the most control politically of this apparatus. She's had her son medically kidnapped. And she's in the fight of her life, going back to court on December 16th over this.
Yeah, I don't think that's a coincidence. Especially, like you said, the other chair, there's 4 of them. The other one, a very similar situation. She was actually walking into a facility, I think it was a mental health facility, actually, where her kid was taken.
Yes, it was. And it was that, and you saw the school system being part of this. So all these institutions, and that's Roberta Lewis, what they're doing is they're creating new good politicians. Daniel McClure, who's her attorney, is running for DA. Roberta Lewis, who is that other Moms for Liberty chair who had her son medically kidnapped, she's running for the state house out in Potawatomi County because these people are tired of the government stepping on family rights and reaching into a family and taking somebody's child. It's the most egregious thing you can do. It's inhumane.
And like you said, he was doing so well. And the fact that they go to court and say, he's going to die if we don't take him out of this home. But he was mowing the lawn.
Right.
It's like,
right.
I don't know.
Be darn the facts. Right.
So what's the court hearing that's coming up? what is that one addressing?
That is an adjudication hearing. And so this is the big hearing where the show cause hearing is, does the government have they met the legal standard to keep him in custody for now? Adjudication is where parents are supposed to have the right to state their whole case about this child. Does this child really even need to be in custody? So there will be a lot of evidence presented here. And I think this is going to be a really big hearing. You know, the different thing about this case, she does have great legal representation. At both of the show cause hearings, crowds of people showed up and were protesting outside. There's a huge shroud of secrecy. Nobody gets to go into these hearings, but it makes a big difference when you have legislators. You had Jake Merrick, who's running for governor, was outside with his whole camera crew and interviewing people. There were lots of other families who were experiencing this same thing out in Canadian County. Canadian County's DHS office is a massive problem. I did an article about the two different supervisors on this case. They are both LGBT activists. They both live an LGBT lifestyle. They're both involved with nonprofits that help recruit LGBT foster parents, those kind of things. They're involved with nonprofits that push for LGBT rights. We're seeing a huge number of people who moved into the DHS system who are activists in this area. Both of the supervisors are both of the CPS supervisors, so that's the initial unit that's involved to investigate. And then when a child comes into permanent custody, which happened at the second show cause hearing with Presten, it's moved to a permanency worker and supervisor. And that supervisor is a man, and I reported about he and his same-sex spouse are part of the bear culture, which is a subset of the male gay community. It's really difficult to say that they're not being persecuted because they are a conservative Christian family and she's a parents' rights activist. So there are a lot of targets on this family, considering who has a lot of power and control in this.
Yeah, so on the next hearing, when they go in, if she regains custody, do you think this whole thing will start back over again? Do you think they'll just keep coming back as a vicious cycle? Or do you think if she wins, they move on?
Well, let me say this. They've set up what they call a youth justice center out in Canadian County. And it's supposed to be the new model for child welfare. What it does is it puts everything under one roof. You got the judge there. You got the assistant district attorney, who's the prosecutor. You've got DHS people there. You've got all these services there and all this, drug testing, and you've got the kids shelter kind of thing there, and you've got therapists. You've got all this under one roof. And it's a tremendously bad idea when it comes to individual freedoms, because what we see on this case already is they're having these things that they call staffings all together. All of those parts are getting together and predetermining these cases before you even go to the hearing. So all of the checks and balances in the system have been erased by this new model. So DHS, the people that are supposed to be keeping DHS in check are the district attorney in that county. The information about the case can come to that district attorney, and that district attorney can say, no, this doesn't meet the standard of law. This child, you don't have proof that they're abused or neglected, and can deny to pursue that. It's over. That kid's back with parents, or you're not even getting an emergency custody order. We're never taking this kid, right? That's vanished. They're all on the same team. You also have the judges. The judges are now all on the same team with DHS. The judge should be the one sitting there on the bench and determining if DHS is telling the truth, if they're giving them all the information. They're supposed to be a neutral party. That's not happening. The representation that most of the time that parents get, they end up with court-appointed attorneys. They're all there in these staffings that are not supposed to be happening. It's essentially a hearing without the parents, but they don't call it a hearing so they can get away with it.
So just talking about it before they ever go into the courtroom.
Absolutely.
Predetermining what the outcome's going to be.
It's already happened on this case. And I know a staffing in DHS used to be where a supervisor and a worker get together and go through and make sure that they're operating within the law, make sure they're supporting the Camp family, make sure they're keeping the child with family wherever possible according to the law, all of those things. Now a staffing has become the entire system gets together, and the only ones not participating are the family themselves. So that's what that model is out in Canadian County. And outside of both show cause hearings, there were numerous families with signs saying, this is happening to me out here. It's happening through the DHS system out there. It's happening through family court. We have people where the judges are giving guardianship. Just your family member who could disagree with you politically can come forward and say all kinds of things about you. And the judge just signs off and says, okay, now Aunt whoever has your child. We have those things going out there. All this is happening under one roof. And it's really frightening the amount of power that they have. So I looked into who's running the whole thing. The woman running the whole thing is, she is an unmarried lesbian woman who she technically ran the whole DHS out there before she was running the Justice Center, right? Her partner is also a high-level director for DHS and child welfare. They together have adopted 2 twin babies who are now like 3 years old from DHS. So you'll have to stop and think about this. They're running the whole system. They are ignoring conflicts of interest. For a DHS worker or high-level person to just say, these kids are coming to our house, who's making sure that they're checking all the boxes, trying to get these kids back to their parents as they're mandated by state law to do? Who's saying that they're not sabotaging cases? Who's saying this isn't internal trafficking and that parents don't even have a chance in this process? That's who's running things out there. And we're seeing it more and more. I'm getting calls about Potawatomi County, all of these other counties where just this hugely progressive ideology has taken over. They have no respect for the nuclear family, and they're keeping kids. And we're seeing it across the country. A documentary just came out that was showing this is happening across the country. These kids are going to social workers within the system.
So I just got chills when you said internal trafficking. So do you think that is that just a concern, or do you see that actually happening in certain parts of the country and in the state?
Oh, definitely. Children are trafficked through DHS. We know that. There have been documented cases of children being trafficked through DHS. And there's no accountability because the laws, they distort the law. The privacy laws in Oklahoma are supposed to protect the DHS involved family, their information and their privacy. So DHS is essentially, by that law, supposed to be taking an oath that they don't talk about cases they're not involved in. They don't talk to anyone about this information, that the documentation is kept secure.
That doesn't ever happen.
No, you don't see them following that in-house.
I have a friend that is very involved. She always has foster kids and multiple. And those caseworkers sit down and talk at ball games, and they talk about it to everybody. Very rarely are they like, no, I can't talk about that.
Correct.
It's just like open, because especially in a small town, everybody knows everybody. And then they sat down by their friend, they're talking about, I just took so-and-so's kid and gave it to so-and-so. Like, they talk about it, and it's wild because it's supposed to be confidential.
It is. That's illegal. That's a crime for them to do that. But they get really interested in privacy laws when something goes wrong and they don't want to see what people are doing. So all of a sudden, they take it as nobody can talk about anything in a DHS case. That is not what Title 10A in Oklahoma says. It's supposed to be that DHS keeps this confidential, but the parents have a right to talk to whoever they please about their own case information. But what's happened is it's an absolute blanket gag order. The current, the newest director of DHS has put in policy that says even legislators who are supposed to be oversight for these state agencies cannot get a hold of the whole case file anymore. If a constituent calls them and says, this has happened to me, they can no longer just say, send over the case file. I need to see what you're doing in that agency. So, and they're saying it's privacy. It's these privacy laws. So they're using the privacy, distorting them to cover their own sins.
So I know initially Dana said, I mean, she would talk to me on the phone, but she was like, I can't sit down and talk about it because there's a gag order. And now she's like, well, now I can't talk about it because I'm already afraid they're not going to give me my kid back. And so, she's like, I can't say anything publicly right now, or I'm going to, get another slap on the wrist and another mark against me. So
it's the ultimate extortion.
Yeah.
To have power over your child being with you or not.
So what do you see that needs to happen to change this? Or is it something at this point that is like, it's too far?
That's a really good question. There's a legislator that's been working on this a long time who's now saying burn it down. And from what I'm seeing inside of DHS, and as I shared with you before we started recording, I worked within child welfare. In between, I'm educated and trained as a journalist, but there came a time when I just answered a calling because I was involved with some state custody kids. I was a frontline child welfare worker. I also worked at the state office within a unit that oversaw kids in congregate care. So group homes, mental health facilities, the places where the most abuse occurs within the system. And don't be fooled. Kids are much more likely to be abused when they come into the system than in the general population. So this is not a system that keeps kids safe. But when you look at, I know what this is supposed to look like, so I know where they're breaking the law. And throughout this case, they broke the law in many, many places. And they're not following the mandates and the essential purpose of DHS. This is supposed to be a helpful agency that comes beside a family in their worst hour when things are not good and helps them correct the conditions that will make their kids safe in their home. They're supposed to make
reunification is the goal.
It absolutely
it's supposed to be.
State mandated by law that reunification is always the goal, but that's not what's happening. And the money behind this has a lot to do with why that's not happening. So the money train has to stop.
Oh yeah. So let's talk about the genetics that have come up recently.
Okay.
So his mom is under the impression that he was potentially misdiagnosed originally and that he doesn't even have CML. So tell us a little bit about that.
So I can tell you it's reasonably new information for me. I've been spending a couple of days trying to get up to speed with this because I'm not medically trained. So this is what happens with the
neither are most of our listeners.
Exactly.
So it's just
but she's given me, this family has been incredibly transparent, and every family that's come to me that I've written their story about DHS overreach has been incredibly transparent. She's given me logins to all his medical records, everything. And what it shows here is back in early 2024, when they diagnosed him with CML, is that they did this smear, and they actually documented that this might not be CML, that they were seeing some things and some markers that were shifting to the left that would indicate that this has more to do with some of Presten's genetic mutations, which could be treated with other things and not cancer. But you can see through the documentation, and I have it here, I have all kinds of things from his medical records. You can see in the documentation that when that comes up, there'll be someone on the lab reports that acknowledges it, but then it's just thrown to the side. And we go to chemo. We go to chemo every time. And if you understand that Presten has this specific genetic mutation that makes it difficult for him to, number one, his glutathione levels are trash. They're very, very low. So regeneration of those cells, those kind of things don't happen for him. That's something that mom was treating at home, which was part of why he was improving over the year. They were using a topical to raise those glutathione levels. And that you look at things like leucovorin that would help that folinic acid basically get to his cells. And that's why it helps with autism. It helps with certain forms of cancer. Those things are in place, but they never wanted to look at that as the actual cause of his symptoms. And then a lot of the symptoms that he had during treatment, because he was on the same chemo back in 2024 that didn't work, that he's on now.
So is he still on treatment?
Yes, he's on oral chemo. He has to be. He's in DHS custody. But there was the strangest week in the hospital, and I think this goes back to it. They had tried the chemo. It wasn't working. The oncologist acknowledged it wasn't working. They said they were going to change the chemo. Mom said, can we back off for a few days because this massive infection from the bone marrow biopsy, can we just let his body catch up for a couple of days? And that's when they broke and said, okay, we stopped this chemo. And within that period, we're going to go ahead and let you start the glutathione lotion. We're going to let you start the leucovorin. Well, days later, his levels start to get better. The hospital goes back and said it was just a delayed reaction from the chemo. And it wasn't from these other things that indicate he could have something completely different with deficiencies going on here. And it makes you wonder, does he even have CML? And how many of these kids and patients are in hospitals being treated with chemotherapy for something they're not willing to look at? There's proof here.
So I know he has MTHFR mutation.
He does.
And so are there more mutations along with that? Or is that the main one?
So that's the main one. That's the main one for him. They do have in here about the Philadelphia chromosome,
okay,
which is really common to autistic. And I say kids because CML is typically an old person's cancer, except for we do see it in autistic kids.
Okay.
And now, do we see it in autistic kids because they're all vaccine injured in this generation? We don't know.
And most of the vaccine injured kids have MTHFR mutation because they can't detox appropriately. They have low glutathione. They can't absorb folate or, folic acid because it's synthetic. So
those are the dots. You just connected them from what happened to him at 2 years old all the way up. Is this all a matter of a vaccine injured child and what happens genetically after that? But there's a huge industry that's making a whole lot of money treating them for cancer. That's what they don't want to answer here. And so going back to the money incentive, I think it's important for people to understand in these medical kidnapping cases, as soon as a kid like Presten comes into care, the second he's even in emergency custody, Sooner Care, so Medicaid, takes over. Where Presten's private insurance that he was on might have some limits for things. Now there's no limits. The taxpayers are paying every single bill. So you have an incentive from the hospital for kids to be in care and for them to participate in that process of keeping them in care. You have an incentive from DHS. When a kid comes into custody, there's money behind that. When a kid stays in custody, there's more federal money behind that. If a parent's rights are terminated, there's more money behind that. If they adopt a kid out, there's more money behind that.
So DHS gets more money each time one of those things happen.
Each time they do their job terribly and don't reunite a child at home. So the incentives, the financial incentives in the child welfare system are perverse. They're in reverse.
So I wanted to read what she said to me specifically when we were talking about that. I wanted to read the text from his mom because I know the MTHFR mutation was one of them, but she said he had 3 tests that showed leukemoid reaction, DNA instability, meaning it wasn't leukemia, and should have explored his genetics, and they kept ignoring it.
Exactly.
And so I don't know if she knew at the time that that's what it was. I think this was a pretty recent discovery for her.
Very recent.
And I cannot imagine, because every parent is going to dig in and research and try to figure out what's happening. Coming to the realization that he probably never had cancer to begin with makes me sick to even think about. And it's not even my child. But to look at that and be like, he probably doesn't even have it. And he's taking chemo. They've almost killed him twice. And so is this something she's going to bring up in court to be explored more?
I would hope so. I'm not at all involved with her legal representation. I've just been digging into this as an investigative journalist. But when you just said it out loud here, it may be the first time I've ever heard publicly people discussing that perhaps not just Presten, but thousands of other kids and autistic kids across the country could be part of this financial machine where they're being treated for a disease that they do not have. And in doing so, withholding the actual cure.
But cure for what? Because they don't actually have it. It's just a genetic mutation. They need nutritional support.
Exactly.
That's it. Glutathione, folate,
Yes,
basic nutrients.
And that's being withheld within this system that's supposedly treating them. So I wonder how many parents would, I hope people, if you know someone who has a child with CML, will forward this podcast so they can start asking questions.
I have another, 2 more parents coming on with medical kidnapping cases.
Okay.
One of them is cancer. I don't know, her kid was diagnosed with cancer, and I don't know if he is autistic, but I'll be very curious to find out.
Right.
And I'm going to reach out to her prior to and actually look through the records, because if they look similar to his, if this is uncovering something so much bigger, it just makes me sick to even think about all these kids that are being treated that may not even have it.
Right. But
So,
they're multi-million-dollar babies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This is seriously expensive treatment, unneeded treatment if it is unneeded. And there's a lot of people and systems that depend on that.
Yeah. Cancer has a cure. We know that. But the treatment makes them way more money.
Exactly. But he's still stuck in the system. One of the points that Dana made in interviewing her was the reason that these chemotherapies weren't even helping him was because they weren't addressing that block of the folinic acid, and they weren't addressing the glutathione levels. And so she even said, I was never necessarily completely anti-chemo. They just wouldn't listen that if they're going to do this anyway, you have to open up these pathways.
Can't detox appropriately with that mutation.
Exactly. So they just weren't open to listening to that at all. Her voice has been silenced, and this research that's real that parents are bringing in, I think they discount it immediately.
So what do you think the biggest takeaway for people for this, obviously being aware that the system is very corrupt, but like next steps that they can take or things to be aware of?
Well, I would say about the Mooney case, there's a hearing coming up on December 16th. There's also a Give, Send, Go. It's called Pennies for Preston that you can look for if you want to contribute to their legal fund. But as far as a parent, I think every parent needs to be aware that this system does have the power now. It's a distorted power to reach in and take your children, whether it's some kind of educational neglect, whether it's medical neglect. I was looking at something today that said only around 15% of kids that are taken into the system can be sort of proven to be abused. The rest fall under neglect, which is a nebulous term.
Speculation.
Yes, there can be a lot of speculation. Even though there's statutory definitions for these things for neglect, that's the catch-all category that people need to be aware of. And they need to have very good representation in these cases, because everyone's sort of on the same page against them, as we said, as far as judges, prosecutors, DHS, medical experts. So you need to have the best of representation. We see that the public defenders are on the same team as the institutions for the most part. So they need to be aware. This is something that needs to be stopped, and know who your legislators are. When these cases come up, call them, email them, bother them. Say, I want to hear that you're on the right side of this issue. The other thing is there's a huge effort for a grand jury petition to investigate. There have been several grand jury petitions to investigate DHS and the court systems and corruption therein. There are very powerful forces in Oklahoma stopping those. So that's the public's last-ditch effort. We've tried everything else to stop a tyrannical government, and we're going to go to a grand jury petition. We've had grand jury petitions, and they have to collect a certain number of signatures, the whole process to it. We've had a grand jury petition succeed, and then they just never assigned a judge to it. Right? We have one out in Payne County that just went on, and one of the dads that was involved, that was one of the petitioners, ended up thrown in jail on $1 million bond. I wrote an article about that.
$1 million?
$1 million bond. We don't put murderers on $1 million bonds.
That's extreme.
Yes, and this was over his own case about trying to protect his child, and they misused the court system to shut him up. We have the former Speaker of the House and the current Speaker of the House both made motions to add on to that petition, to petition the court to quash the whole thing, to kill it, and they were successful. They killed that grand jury petition. These are Republicans. So we have a lot of false politicians out there. I encourage people to get involved with the grassroots efforts. The only way things change with a tyrannical government is if we start running for those school board seats, if we start running for those county commissioner seats, if you start running for our state legislature. stepping up and supporting the good people who are, because we don't have enough of them.
Yeah. Well, is there anything else that that we skipped over or we need to add?
I don't think so. That's a lot on this case. I will say I'm going to continue to write on this at v1sut.com. So continue to check in, and I'm putting together something about those recent sort of medical findings saying, does he have CML? And I'm doing some research into, has this been a broad misdiagnosis? So look for that soon.
Yes, and we'll put in the description a link for the Moms for Liberty and a link to all of your research so people can follow you there.
Great. I appreciate you shining a light on this.
We're good.